So I've talked about octopoids from the Europa, the moon of Jupiter, and I stated that were we to encounter these capacities in another organism, that would be human. I said, this is my understanding of what Abdu'l-Baha says. I offer you the next quote from some answered questions.
As the perfection of man is entirely due to the composition of the atoms of the elements, to their measure, to the method of their combination, and to the mutual influence and action of the different beings, then, since man was produced 10 or 100,000 years ago from these earthly elements with the same measure and balance, the same method of combination and mingling, and the same influence of the other beings, exactly the same man existed then as now. This is evident and not worth debating. 1,000 million years hence, if these elements of man are gathered together and arranged in this special proportion, and if the elements are combined according to the same method, and if they are affected by the same influence of other beings, exactly the same man will exist. For example, if after 100,000 years there is oil, fire, a wick, a lamp, and the lighter of the lamp, briefly, if there are all the necessaries which now exist, exactly the same lamp will be obtained.
Okay, some people will be like, well, obviously it's not, it's a different lamp. Yes, it's a different lamp structurally, right? Its physical instantiation, its physical embodiment would be different, but it's still a lamp. And why I say this is obvious emergence, because he's saying, okay, so just so you don't misunderstand me, if 100,000 years ago this happened, and you actually had the combination of elements, right, where the rational faculty of humankind, the human kingdom came into being, where that being could penetrate the laws, or uncover the laws of the universe, penetrate the mysteries of existence, create amazing inventions, etc., 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 that's a man. Now, obviously, a 1 billion years from now organism capable of meditation, self-reflection, scientific discovery, and moral, ethical, and social development isn't the biological lineage of humankind that Abdu'l-Baha is talking about. He's talking about a set of functional capacities that are grounded in a biological, chemical, physics structure capable of reflecting those capacities. So obviously we're discussing, I think it's eminently clear that Abdu'l-Baha is stating, no, once again, you're misunderstanding what I mean by human. What I mean by human are these sets of capacities and ideal virtues. And this universe is capable of producing it. And wherever it produces it, if you find those qualities, that's the human kingdom. In case there is any residual doubt on this, humankind obviously can be instantiated, embodied in various different physical forms. By that I mean non-terrestrial. This is a quote from Shoghi Effendi, actually, from The Light of Divine Guidance, not Lights of Guidance, the compilation, but The Light of Divine Guidance, Volume 2.
Abdu'l-Baha stated there are other worlds than ours, which are inhabited by beings capable of knowing God.
If there are other entities capable of knowing God, and again we walked through that process, there was no terrestrial globe, there were no species, and then the commingling of inanimate elements gave life, and then actually went through the capacity for growth and for sensorial capacities, and then suddenly began to actually be able to meditate and self-reflect and think on things, and by a slow process scale the ladder of civilization, that they then begin to unravel or unearth the capacities that they actually have, those ideal virtues, until the call of God can come. That was one of our previous quotes, that they are then capable of knowing God. That is after the fact. I've gone through this massively long process where we were already slowly becoming civilized before that became our capacity. Then these inhabited beings capable of knowing God on other worlds are human. They are functionally defined emergent properties. So obviously they're not genealogically human, that much is clear. Thus it makes sense when we find in the recorded talks of Abdu'l-Baha that he says this.
How is it possible to conceive that these stupendous stellar bodies are not inhabited? Verily, they are peopled. But let it be known that the dwellers accord with the elements of their respective spheres. These living beings do not have states of consciousness like unto those who live on the surface of this globe. The power of adaptation and environment molds their bodies and states of consciousness, just as our bodies and minds are suited to our planet. Beings who inhabit those distant luminous bodies are attuned to the elements that have gone into their composition of their respective spheres.
So this is actually a quote from a talk in a previous publication called Divine Philosophy. How is it possible to conceive this stupendous stellar bodies are not inhabited? And he says, verily they're peopled. And it's interesting. There's a series of things that have to do with evolutionary theory in this quote. The dwellers accord with the elements of their respective spheres. Naturally, the elements that would make up their physical animal bodies would be different. And then he says, they do not have states of consciousness like unto those who live on the surface of this globe. So their states of consciousness are different than ours. And then it says, the power of adaptation and environment molds their bodies and states of consciousness just as our bodies and minds are suited to our planet. So we've already heard that Abdu'l-Baha has stated we went through a process of evolution. The term is actually used. We've seen how we've had slow, gradual physical changes. And that we are included in this quote, that there is the power of adaptation and environment. Now, there's this interplay between adaptation and environment that molds our states of consciousness just as our bodies and minds. There's nothing disconcerting here at all. That's what we currently believe. That there is our adaptations are having an interplay with the environment in which we are in, which molds our state of consciousness and our bodies to be suited to certain ecological niches. And that's what Abdu'l-Baha is stating. And once again, there are beings capable of knowing God who are adapted with different states of consciousness, but are still have all of these capacities, so therefore they are human. So the Baha'i faith, to a great extent, sees the human reality to be states of consciousness, a set of capacities and functions that can be realized in entirely different forms at entirely different times within the historical timeline of our universe, 1 billion years hence. Further, the process of the creation of these forms is according to a natural system of adaptation to their specific biological niches, and simply put, this certainly sounds quite familiar. This is where we run up into this challenge of, because the Baha'i faith clearly states that human consciousness and capacities can be embodied or realized in multiple physical substructures. This is what makes it so challenging from the Baha'i perspective, and I think just intellectually, if you believe there is even the capacity or possibility of healing beings, to reduce those sets of capacities simply to the physical structure of humankind. And this is something that has an unwieldy name in modern philosophy. It's called multiple realizability. So multiple realizability means that you have something which is functionally defined, right? And that thing can be realized within multiple physical mediums and multiple physical realizations or structures. So there's simpler examples of this. One would be money. So for example, I live in Canada, and if you were to say what is $5, for example, in Canadian money. I can hand you a $5 bill. I say, well, this is $5. And then you say, well, is like the paper? So you start studying the physics of the papers. You start looking at pulp and ink and dye, trying to find where the $5 is. And you're studying it and you're studying it. And then all of a sudden I drop what we call 5 loonies, which are $1 coins. And you're like, well, that can't be $5 because those are metal and they're circular and they are not flammable. And this over here is flammable and paper, right, with ink on it that doesn't have any ink. When you started looking at the physical substrate, you can look like with the human brain at actually how the $5 is represented symbolically or encoded within that piece of paper, but that isn't the $5 itself. Another example would be a thermometer. These are common examples often used within the concept of multiple realizability. What is a thermometer? A thermometer is anything that measures heat. It's not a definitive, it has to be mercury in a glass vial. Well, what about a laser thermometer? And what about an alcohol thermometer? A thermometer is that which measures heat. It's functionally defined, so you can realize a thermometer in multiple different physical substructures, and it's still a thermometer. It's its function that defines us. If I'm doing mathematical computation within my mind, or you're seeing it done on a computer, or I'm using an abacus, or I'm using spools of paper in an older computer, or I'm using digital, if I'm using my fingers or rocks, in each case, computation or calculation can be happening, and it's not the physical structure that's actually that defines it, right? So, excuse me. So, if I take, for example, a book, I use this in another context, but say I take Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity, and I actually take that paper, right? And I write it on a piece of physical paper, right? It is now, square, and it's flammable, and it's ink, and it's pulp, and it, weighs, a couple grams, right? It's square, etc. Now, I could take that exact same paper, and I could grab a bowling ball, and I could use a little scribe, and I could scribe out the entirety of Einstein's 1905 paper on a bowling ball. Now, for me to say that Einstein's paper is black, spherical, heavy, and not flammable, and it's also rectangular, light, flammable, and made of pulp, not resin, is missing the point of what Einstein's 1905 paper is. Einstein's 1905 paper is a set of ideas, a set of concepts and arguments that are about our reality and that explain it, right? And it is a well-reasoned, cogent, or parsimonious explanation of reality, and bowling balls can't be cogent. Paper can't be well-reasoned. It is actually the abstract concepts that are encoded on it. Okay, I could then take that off the bowling ball, and I could actually carve it in the side of a tree. I can make an alphabet out of insects and actually write it out on my garage floor. And in each case, Einstein's 1905 paper isn't the insects. It isn't the bowling ball. It isn't the tree trunk. It isn't the paper. It isn't the digital code. It is that which is embodied, and it needs to be embodied in something physically. In a sense, I could then take that same, I could take that same paper, no pun intended here, is 1905 theory, and I could write it in Arabic or Mandarin. I could, put it into Swahili. I could put it into Urdu. And in each case, a translator's job is actually to maintain the propositional and conceptual content through the valley of the different languages. It's because you cannot reduce it to its phonetic substructure. So I offer these because this is really the concept that is being presented. The bowling ball, the paper, the bowling ball is an octopoid. We are actually a piece of physical paper. Some other entity might be a tree trunk. By this I mean that it is these functional capacities, right, that are being embedded in a physical form or realized in a physical form, but they are not held to or bound to that physical structure. Because they're functional, or in this case of Einstein's paper, they are abstract, they can be represented over and over and over and over again in multiple substrates. Like Abdu'l-Baha states that actually you can have a different planet that has different elements, that brings together an arrangement of elements that have this affinity and cohesion, which gives rise to life, etc., etc. All the way up the ladder of civilization until you have a conscious being capable of knowing God on a different planet 1 billion years from now, but it's still human.